Welcome to my new Let's Play of Kirby Air Ride. This was actually my very first Kirby game, so I wanted to revisit it and highlight its unusual legacy. There are 3 modes to choose from, so first up is Air Ride. We have quite a few courses to go through, starting with Fantasy Meadows, and our first vehicle will be the Warp Star. Kirby Air Ride is a very unusual racing game in a few ways, mostly related to its controls. It's actually relatively straightforward. For example, vehicles accelerate automatically, so all you have to worry about is steering and performing specific actions with either A, L, or R. They all do the same thing. So for example, you can inhale enemies, some you'll spit out automatically, and others will give you copy abilities as you might expect. So for fire, we do have to tap A to fire fireballs at our opponent. Other abilities are automatic as you get close to enemies, like Sword. Defeating enemies along the way also gives you speed boosts as well, and you can also use A to charge up a boost. This also causes the Warp Star or other vehicles to slide along the ground in some cases, allowing you to drift. Certain vehicles do not have the ability to boost, unfortunately, but the Warp Star is the default vehicle, and thus is the jack-of-all-trades, well-rounded vehicle. So overall, this is actually going fairly poorly, given that the other vehicles are a lot more specialized, and actually quite a bit faster than the Warp Star, but we managed to win anyway. Next up is Celestial Valley. For this course, I want to use the Winged Star, but I also wanted to mention that you can press X or Y to toggle between different Kirby colors, and some are actually unlockable, but we'll stick with the default pink Kirby for this playthrough. You can also change the handicap settings for each player, and also the CPU level if applicable, and if you press B, you can actually select the vehicle for that particular AI. But let's get started. By comparison to Fantasy Meadows, Celestial Valley is a lot more complicated, both because there are a lot more environmental interactions, including a copy ability roulette at the top of this tree stump. Basically, if you press A, L, or R, you'll get whatever copy ability it lands on. We got sleep, unfortunately, but we also have a lot more environmental interactions like these rails that we can actually go across, and all sorts of ramps. Most vehicles are capable of gliding, though others aren't and only can jump. I wanted the Wing Star specifically because this is a very glide-heavy stage, and thus we'll be able to get ahead very easily by gliding at the right times. But again, you can also interact with dash panels. One thing worth mentioning is you can actually tap A twice to actually, in some cases, interact with a dash panel twice, giving you even more of a boost. It's a very unique racing game in a lot of ways. I have a lot of fond memories of playing through this game, but at the time, it actually wasn't very well liked. If I'm not mistaken, it averaged to about a 60 out of 100 from critics, but it's a bit of a cult classic, I'd say, by modern standards. I almost feel like it's partially because the people who grew up with this game are now old enough to be a vocal minority on the internet, but also I feel like it set the stage for a lot of future games, not only with Kirby, but a lot of other Nintendo games in general, because this was actually the last Kirby game directed by Masahiro Sakurai before he left Nintendo. Interestingly, a lot of similarities can actually be seen from his other games in Air Ride, and there are a few things done in Air Ride that actually would appear in later games like Super Smash Bros. So it is a very interesting game as a bit of a time capsule to an era before a lot of these were standard features in games like Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, for example. Most of the courses are also 2 laps because they're a bit longer than Fantasy Meadows, so we're already done with Celestial Valley. Next is Sky Sands. For this one, I want to use the Wagon Star. The Wagon Star is very unusual because it does not have the ability to boost, so we have to play a little bit differently. We also have Meta Knight as one of our random opponents, so this could be very tricky given that he's actually a fairly difficult CPU to win against. We have a very sneaky shortcut through the sand there. This is a very fast vehicle for what it's worth to compensate for its inability to actually boost. Also, drifting is a lot harder because we actually can't get the boost out of a turn. But we also have this little secret panel here leading to a dash panel. Needle is a very interesting copy ability because you do have to stop to use it, and that is the case for other copy abilities as well, and as a result, I'm not really the biggest fan of this one. It's also worth mentioning that other copy abilities, like we passed by the Plasma Wisp in Celestial Valley, and that actually does work like it does in Superstar, where you actually have to move the control stick back and forth to charge up the plasma shot, and you'll get the various shot types depending on how long you charge it. It's also worth mentioning that copy abilities are finite. You might notice they go away after a certain amount of time. That's not me selecting it, that is actually automatic after a set amount of time. In this stage, we also have these little wheels that give us a little bit of a boost. If you have a vehicle that can charge up, you might want to charge up on the actual turning parts in order to actually be able to boost out of it in a bit. I think Meta Knight's about to catch up to us, which is definitely a problem. But again, this is one of the faster vehicles by default to make up for its shortcomings. And again, it is very interesting that there are a ton of different vehicles with unique attributes that can lead to very unique and varied playstyles depending on what you're looking for in a particular air ride machine. Our next course is Frozen Hillside. For this one, I think I'll actually play as Meta Knight. Meta Knight is a very unusual character. He's actually one of the harder characters to unlock, if I'm not mistaken, or more time-consuming, I should say. There are actually quite a few unlockables in this game, and we'll be going through them after we get through all the main courses. But Meta Knight is essentially a hybrid of two different copy abilities, Sword and Wing. So for example, with Wing, you obviously fly above the ground like this, you can't charge up a boost, but in this case, we also have the ability of Sword, which allows us to automatically attack as we get close to certain enemies and environmental hazards. For example, we can actually break the ice, blocking that shortcut, allowing us to very easily get through that cavern. To me, this is actually one of the tougher courses, but also one of the more memorable courses visually. Maybe it's because I like winter levels in video games, but I definitely like the overall ambiance of the stage with the music and the overall theming of it. We also have this little panel here that causes the ice wall to split apart, allowing us to reach certain dash panels. So again, it's a very interesting game in terms of like not having many buttons, but basically trying to figure out the best timing to use certain actions. Also going through the lower route, there's another switch that just disables the lasers that normally would deal damage. By default, there is no health system, but you can actually enable one in the options, but we'll go over all of the options in more detail after we get through all of the main courses. But for this quick look, I wanted to stay relatively close to the default settings. We are actually running into a bit of trouble here with this one Kirby. Meta Knight is very helpful obviously because he is able to defeat enemies automatically, and thus you don't have to worry about timing a button press, so that's a very easy way to build up speed quickly with Meta Knight. But even then, the AI is definitely giving us a run for our money in this particular race, so we'll do our best to stay ahead as we enter the final stretch here with a bunch of dash panels. We should be good to go. Next up is Magma Flows. For this one, let's use the Shadow Star. It doesn't really matter in this particular setting, but if I'm not mistaken, the Shadow Star's spin attack is a little bit more damaging than some of the others, so for modes where you do have a health system, it's definitely good to keep that in mind. Magma Flows is a very tricky course actually, because there are a lot of different routes of varying levels of speed. So we'll try to do our best to stay on the fastest route, but this section right here is actually automated, so you don't really get a choice in the matter. You can actually fly over these pathways though, which is definitely a good thing to keep in mind if you're in a hurry. We specifically want to take the right rail over here, because if I'm not mistaken, this is the fastest route, and here is a demonstration of Plasma, actually, as another Kirby is right on our tail. We actually missed the Kirby, unfortunately, so we'll do our best to stay ahead. The Rex Wheelie that the Kirby is using is actually very fast, so keep that in mind. By the way, you might also notice that the boost gauge does charge up a bit when actually gliding, and basically the more it charges up, the more you'll boost when you land, depending on if you land properly. You might notice that Kirby will kind of look back at you and wave, and that's basically an indication of whether you landed properly. So otherwise you might tumble a bit and lose a little bit of speed. We also have quite a few rails over here as well. In a lot of cases the rails are faster than traveling typically, but in other cases going out of your way for them can cause more problems, so it's a bit of a risk versus reward. But here's also Wing, since we were talking about that ability earlier. I was actually having trouble actually inhaling the wing enemy there, but again, very similar to Meta Knight's Flight, but again, the main difference is having a sword. It's very interesting how fast a lot of these sections are. In general, this game is fairly slow-paced, which was actually one of the major points of criticism when released, that a lot of the overall speed is lacking in this particular game compared to other games released around the same time, including GameCube games, most notably Mario Kart Double Dash, and especially F-Zero GX, which is exponentially faster than this game where your top speed is often like 20 to 30 miles per hour. Next up is Beanstalk Park. For this one, let's try out the Jetstar. I'll be honest, this might have been a mistake. I'm not really great with this particular vehicle. To tell the truth, I definitely had a lot of bias towards specific vehicles when I played this game growing up. I mostly just stuck with the default stars because they're a lot easier to use than a lot of the more advanced and specialized ones like the Jetstar. Similar to the Wing Star, this one is obviously better in the air than on the ground, but even more so. So the key to using this one is to just glide as much as possible. In this stage, you can actually use the little tree stumps there to launch off, but you might notice that the boost gauge for the gliding charges up very fast for this particular vehicle. But again, it's just a case of I'm not really used to it, so I'm definitely struggling a little bit to get used to it. It's fine if we don't win this particular race. This is definitely a track I struggle a lot with, but again, you might notice we really launch out of every glide point. But again, a lot of vehicles don't even have the ability to glide, and I definitely feel like using one of the wheelie bikes, for example, could definitely cause some problems if you're not used to that in a stage like this, where you're expected to have some gliding ability a lot. I missed the rail twice, unfortunately. That would basically spiral us around and take us to this point here, so unfortunately we are losing a bit of time from that. But yeah, I'm kind of expecting to get second or third at this point, just because I'm definitely floundering a bit. There's also this beanstalk mechanic here, or this wheel mechanic here, where you can basically get taken up to this upper path. Again, it was probably not the best call picking this particular star, but I still wanted to show off as many of the different warp stars as I could. But again, this was definitely not a wise choice as we are falling farther behind first place. So there is some rubber banding in place. I don't think it'll be enough to actually catch up to first place, but maybe we'll be able to steal second here if we're careful. Again, trying to defeat as many enemies as possible along the way to get small speed boosts as we head to the goal. Next is Machine Passage. For this one, I think I'll play as King Dedede. We actually might lose this one as well because, again, Meta Knight is very fast. But King Dedede is a very unique character because he's essentially a hybrid of the wheelie bike that we haven't actually seen yet standalone, but also he has a hammer, as you might expect, which is not a copy ability in Kirby Air Ride, so he does have that unique attribute compared to any other character, including all the variations of Kirby. So for example, you can deal damage with the hammer, it's very strong obviously, so he's one of the more powerful characters if you have a health system enabled, but with the wheelie bike and his overall weight, he's a little bit unwieldy at times, unfortunately, so again, we might not win this one either because of Meta Knight, but again, I mostly just want to show off all the different courses and show off as many characters as possible here. Interestingly, Kirby Air Ride actually has a bit of history beyond the GameCube. If I'm not mistaken, a game called Kirby's Air Ride was actually announced for the Nintendo 64, but was actually more of a downhill racer game, kind of comparable to something like the 1080 snowboarding series from Nintendo. This obviously disappeared and eventually resurfaced as Kirby Air Ride, though it's a very different project in its final state, but again, it's worth mentioning that a lot of Kirby games were actually planned for the N64 and didn't really come to fruition. That was also the case for Metroid as well, where Metroid Prime, I'm pretty sure, started out on the N64, but basically vanished and then resurfaced for the GameCube a little bit later, and frankly, I think it was worth the trade-off because of how good Metroid Prime turned out. But again, it's very interesting, the history of a game like Kirby Air Ride. Even though it's fairly basic in a lot of ways, it's surprisingly unique because of its development and some other quirks to it. We're basically catching up, but this is really close. We might have lost it on that turn, unfortunately, but we'll try to save it at the end here to at least get second, or maybe third, but here we go. Barely third, that's a shame.